I have not.
Welcome, everybody.
Heard of it.
Welcome.
Never seen it.
This is the first of a three-part series, which is going to be Talmudic stories, art, law, and culture. Here, only here, at the Anshe Shalom Wednesday evening Beit Midrash, and thank you for coming out on Tuesday evening. I really appreciate it, actually, because tomorrow night's Purim. And in the spirit of Purim, I would like to begin with a story. Spain, 1493. The Goldstein family had been in Spain for hundreds of years. Some say even as much as 1,000. And when they came around and said, in 1492, all of you Jews, it's time to shape up or ship out. If you want to stay in Spain, you have to become Catholic. Many, many Jews. Most of the Jews left. Some Jews stayed and became Catholic. In this case, including the Goldstein family. And they went to the priest, and they learned how to do Catholic things. And when they finished with Catholic school, the priest took them down to the baptismal font and put water on their heads and said, "You're a Catholic, you're a Catholic, you're a Catholic." 1493, the Inquisition wants to be sure that all of the new Catholics are duly observing their religion, and the local priest goes by the Goldstein home on Friday afternoon. And he knocks on the door. "Mr. Goldstein," "Yes, Father, please come in. It's so good to see you. We're just cooking our Lenten meal." And the priest says, "Are you cooking chicken?" And Mr. Goldstein says, No, I'm cooking fish." And the priest says, "Are you sure? Because it smells like chicken." No, absolutely not. "I'm cooking fish." He said, "Goldstein, don't lie to me. If you're backsliding, it's very serious. I smell chicken." And Goldstein says, "No, it's a fish." And the priest goes over and he opens the pot. And there in the pot, simmering gently, steaming gently in the sauce, is a beautiful chicken. And the priest says, "Goldstein, that's a chicken." He says, "No, it's not, it's a fish." "Goldstein, you know, it's Lent, and you can't eat meat during Lent. It's very serious." I did just what you said." And the priest says, "What do you mean, just what I said?" "Well, I put it in the pot, and I said, you're a fish, you're a fish, you're a fish." Which I tell you that story now. It was a chicken, and he converted it, and it became a fish. So that story I wanted to share now for two reasons. One, because Purim is tomorrow night, and it's a silly story. The second reason being that when you talk about anything, you have to define your terms and be very clear what it is you're talking about, because otherwise you may think you're looking at something which is something totally different. I want to define some terms for the next couple of weeks, because when we talk about Talmud, we can talk about a lot of different things and think about a lot of different things. So important in talking about Talmud is first the concept of genre. So that you have to be attentive to what the thing is that you're looking at. In rabbinic literature, there are midrashim. Midrashim are comments on biblical verses that use certain generally agreed upon techniques of deriving meaning to understand what we do with those biblical verses, how they are full of meaning for us in our Jewish lives. There is a genre called Mishnah. Mishnah is a very different form from Midrash. It doesn't necessarily start on the biblical verse, even though it may come from biblical verses way far back. It states a law in an apodictic fashion, which it says, this is what you do. And occasionally it goes into cases and things get mixed in. Very similar to Mishnah is a Baraita. Baraitas are Mishnahs that didn't make it into the Mishnah or made it into somebody else's Mishnah. Sometimes they're preserved in the Tosefta, which is an independent work full of Baraitas. Sometimes they are preserved in the Talmud and not either in the Tosefta or the Mishnah. But they are from that same period. I'll explain the periods in a moment. Then there are things that are sometimes called Memras, which are sometimes, depending on who's talking about it, called Gemara, which are short statements by later rabbis discussing things that are going on in the Mishnah usually. They're comments on the Mishnah. when we're talking over the next few classes, we'll also talk about different historical periods. So each of those different kinds of rabbinic literature come from different periods. The beginning of the period that we're looking at is the Second Temple period, and late in the Second Temple period. The Second Temple is built by those who come back from Babylonia with Ezra and Nehemiah. The temple is rebuilt, and then the temple is, things are kind of quiet for a while. The temple is messed up by the Greeks. We celebrate Hanukkah, the Greeks being the Greco-Roman, the Hellenistic Syrians. We celebrate Hanukkah. The Hasmonean family gets the temple back, which is the Maccabees, and they make themselves kings over Israel, restoring the kingship, which is all very nice, but then after a couple of generations, we understand that they became quite corrupt, and we no longer like them when we look back and talk about them. After 3 or 4 generations of Hasmonean kings, they brought in the Romans to sort of help manage things, and that went downhill very quickly. The Romans take things over, and we move into the Tanaitic period. So the period of the Tanaim is the period of the composition of the Mishnah, with some very old halakha on the basis of old halakha. The Tanaim bridge the destruction of the temple, and pretty much end. The period of the Tanaim ends when the Mishnah is finished, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, finishes putting the Mishnah together. That begins the period of the Talmud, which is the Amoraic period, starting from about 220 CE, and goes another 300 years. After that, so that happens both in Roman Palestine and in Sasanian Babylonia and Persia. The end of that period, we primarily are in Babylonia and talking about the Stamaitic period, which is when they did all the putting together and polishing of the Babylonian Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds. There is Talmud Da'ara Yisrael, what we call the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Palestinian Talmud. And there is the Babylonian Talmud, which is the Talmud from Babylonia. Most of what we spend our time with is Babylonian Talmud, for a reason that I will explain in just a moment. The Babylonian Talmud is a great recycler of earlier materials. So they take materials from all this earlier stuff and pack it in together, and sometimes verbessere, to use a Yiddish word that one of my teachers once liked to use, which is to take something and change it so it's nice. They don't usually tell you what it was before they changed it. And if you're concerned about what it was before they changed it, or historical authenticity or earlier sources, it can be frustrating, but then it's fun when you see the before and after pictures and say, oh, look what they did. And we can talk about that perhaps another time, which probably in our 3rd session we'll talk about that a little bit. Within the Babylonian Talmud, in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, they kept working on midrashic forms. So they kept making midrashim, and midrashic material tended to go in the midrashim. And the Talmud had its own form that it was much more discussions of the Mishnah with some stories that made its way in. The Bavli put everything in one big work, so Midrash is in there, and stories are in there, and other things are in there. Which brings me to what we are doing tonight, which is stories in the Talmud as art. Historically, we lived in a culture that was very concerned with how do we live Jewishly. And we still live in that culture, different kind of culture. When studying the Babylonian Talmud, very quickly, the study of the Talmud outside of Babylonia came to focus on what do we do? In Babylonia, the yeshivot were there, and if you needed the question, you went to the yeshiva and you said, what do I do with this chicken? And they told you. And then they went back to doing what they were doing, which was really great and glorious creation of Talmud and discussion of Talmud, and very exciting, but very often having little to do with is my chicken kosher or not kosher. But you could get that question answered very quickly and then went back to doing what they were doing. Outside of Babylonia, they set up these academies for study, but they also had to know, what do we tell the people about the chicken? Because I have the Talmud and it says 30 things. And the study of Talmud and Jewish study became very quickly focused in certain periods, and it had a rise and fall on halacha. What do we do day to day? How do we distill that practice out of the Talmud? So a lot of the time, we look back and study Talmud on the basis of the halacha. And particularly in the intervening 1,300 years since they finished working on the Talmud, we've had several major halachic works. Rambam is usually cited as the first big one of the trilogy. The Arba Turim of the Rosh is the second one. And then the Shulchan Aruch is the third one. Very practical. What do we do? How do we live as Jews? So when we look at Talmud, it's often focused in yeshivot on the halachic sections, leaving everything else out. The other everything else is Agada, which is narratives, stories. So those are usually opposed to each other. When they started setting up the State of Israel, even earlier, with the rise of Zionism in the 19th century, in the end of the 19th century, everyone had a nation. And the Jews sitting in Europe and other places said, well, what about us? What is our nation? All the other nations had literature, and the scholars at the time turned to the Talmud and said, well, this is our literature. But the field of halacha had pretty well been carved out by religious scholars. And in trying to find a room for non-religious people, let's look at Agada. We have myths, we have stories, and then they also had Ifer Beseret. There's a great work called The Book of Legends by Bialik and Rudnitsky, where they gather all these mythic stories from the rabbinic literature and they make it a little bit nicer sometimes. But the study of Agada began with an assumption that that was what provided for us our national history. That was where they looked. As the 20th century progressed and people started writing scholarly books, trying to put these narratives together into holistic wholes, they found that it's a problem when you have one story about Rabbi Akiva and how he got started, and a totally different story about Rabbi Akiva and how he got started, and they're not the same story. So which is the story? And scholarship for a while tried to fit them together to make nice, smooth wholes that told the story, entireties. Probably about 45 years ago, academic scholarship said, but there's a problem because they actually are very different stories and they can't both be right. And one response was to say, well, it's all fiction and we can't trust any of it, so we just can't pay attention to it. Another response was to say, these stories actually are very important and meaningful, and they are beautifully done. And although we can't necessarily rely on them as history, we're not going to say they're entirely fiction. And we have to understand how they tell us the things that they tell us. So it brings us, I think, to what I want to posit as the core reason for tonight's class. Why do we study stories? Because they're beautiful. One of the aspects of stories, when they are well done in the Talmud, and they're not always well done and they're not always necessarily beautiful, is that they are literary works of art. And there are times when Talmudic stories are specifically formulated in ways that are artistic and elegant and designed to give us meaning and events and people and teach us something at the same time. Because for the most part, we can assume, I think safely to say, that the rabbis had an agenda to teach us how to live as good Jews, how to live well as Jews, and how to live as good Jews. So, now we're going to do the handouts. And I'm going to start with a story that is told by someone who we look at as an historian. That historian is Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish general who was defending in the north during the Bar Kokhba revolt, and gave in, went over to the Roman side, but the Romans kept him alive, and he wrote a thorough history of the Jewish people. the first point that I want to raise about the stories and the way that they're told and the art of the telling them is that when stories are preserved in rabbinic literature, we have to remember that the rabbis chose to tell this story and not to leave it out. They could have left out a particular story. And presumably there are many stories that they did not tell. We know there are many stories they did not tell. And that the way that they tell stories reflect who they are. So, please bear in mind, among other things, we're talking about rabbi stories and not folk stories. One theory about folk stories is folk stories where you have all the silly supernatural stuff. Yonah Frankel, who was a major scholar working on rabbinic stories in Israel through the latter half of the 20th century, liked to believe or argue that the rabbinic stories were focused sort of on a rational worldview based in human experience, your day-to-day experience. He said that there are three main kinds of stories. There are epic stories. And epics, he would say, describe a world that is stable and describable. You can listen to the story, and you can go out and you can imagine that that story happened in the world that you live in. So there are lyrical stories where the world can be fanciful and reflects the storyteller's emotions and their heart, how they want the world to be. It can be very idealistic and rosy-tinted, rosy-hued glasses. And they can be dramatic, where the story is told in a way that emphasizes oppositions. I just want to think about those as we go through. The first story describes something that was in everybody's history. So not telling about events that were seen by the narrators. The thing that we have to know is that this is in the transition point between the Hasmonean family, the Hasmonean Empire, and the Herodian Empire. Herod was, the way that we understand him to have been, was a usurping servant of the end of the corrupt Hasmonean clan. Hyrcanus is the Hasmonean king. Herod Antipater was the Roman Idumean, potentially a convert, who got in very close with the Romans. And I'm going to read loudly and clearly, with your forbearance, this long, boring piece from Josephus' Antiquities. I invite you to follow along. It's important to see what some of the main events are and who the figures are, because we're going to go into a very different telling of the story in just a moment. According to Herod, the principal men among the Jews, when they saw Antipater and his sons to grow so much in the goodwill the nation bare to them, and in the revenues which they received out of Judea, and out of Hyrcanus' own wealth, they became ill-disposed to him. For indeed, Antipater had contracted a friendship with the Roman emperors. And when he had prevailed with Hyrcanus to send them money to the Romans, he took it to himself, and purloined the present intended, and sent it as if it were his own, and not Hyrcanus' gift to them. Hyrcanus heard of this mismanagement, that was a typo, but took no care about it. Nay, he was rather very glad of it. But the chief men of the Jews were therefore in fear, because they saw that Herod was a violent and bold man, and very desirous of acting tyrannically. So they came to Hyrcanus, and now accused Antipater openly, and said to him, How long will you be quiet under such actions as are now done? Or do you not see that Antipater and his sons have already seized upon the government, and that it is only the name of a king which is given to you? But do not you suffer these things to be hidden from you, nor do you think to escape danger by being so careless of yourself and your kingdom, for Antipater and his sons are not now stewards of your affairs. Do not deceive yourself with such a notion. They are evidently absolute lords. For Herod, Antipater's son, has slain Hezekiah, and those that were with him, and have thereby transgressed our law, which has forbidden to slay any man, even though if he were a wicked man, unless he had first been condemned to suffer death by the Sanhedrin. Yet he has been so insolent as to do this, and that without any authority from you. So Herod, Antipater's son, Antipater is supposed to be a steward, has gotten in with the Romans and in fact become a de facto king, and the official king of the Jewish people has become a second-class functionary. which is problematic because the Antipater and his family are thugs. So Hyrcanus hears this and complies with them. The mothers also of those that had been slain by Herod raised his indignation, for those women continued every day in the temple, persuading the king and the people that Herod might undergo a trial before the Sanhedrin for what he had done. Hyrcanus was so moved by these complaints that he summoned Herod to come to his trial for what was charged upon him. Accordingly, he came, but his father had persuaded him to come not like a private citizen, but with a guard for the security of his person, and that when he had settled the affairs of Galilee in the best manner he could for his own advantage, he should come to his trial, but still with a body of men sufficient for his security on his journey, yet so that he would not come with so great a force as might look like terrifying Hyrcanus, but still such a one as might not expose him naked and unguarded to his enemies. So you go to court and you be sure to go with a bodyguard, so that whatever happens, you can still do things your own way. He had to settle things in the Galilee, so that he makes sure that while he's gone, there's no uprising in the Galilee. So very clear, cement your power base, and bring mercenaries with you. However, Sextus Caesar, president of Syria, wrote to Hyrcanus and desired him to clear Herod and dismiss him at his trial, and threatened him beforehand if he did not do it. So loading the deck. Outside political forces make very clear this is someone who's protected by the Roman government. We don't want there to be any problems. We want to be very clear that you know in advance that of course he will be innocent. Right? Right. Which epistle of his was the occasion of Hyrcanus' delivering Herod from suffering any harm from the Sanhedrin, for he loved him as his own son. But when Herod stood before the Sanhedrin with the body of men about him, he affrighted them all. He intimidated them. And no one of his former accusers dared after that to bring any charge against him, but there was a deep silence, and nobody knew what was to be done. When affairs stood thus, one whose name was Sameas, a righteous man he was, and for that reason above all fear, rose up and said, "O you that are assessors with me," the assessors on the jury, on the court, or prosecutors might be a better word, "and you that are our king, I neither myself have known such a case, nor do I suppose that any one of you can name its parallel, that one who is called to take his trial by us ever stood in such a manner before us. Instead, everyone, whosoever he is, that comes to be tried by the Sanhedrin, presents himself in a submissive manner, and like one that is in fear of himself, and that endeavors to move us to compassion, with his hair disheveled, and in a black mourning garment. But this admirable man Herod, who is accused of murder, and called to answer so heavy an accusation, stands here clothed in purple." Remember that purple was reserved for royalty, which the Rabbi mentioned, I think just this week on Shabbos, is why tchelet got to be so expensive. This became a Roman law. You had to be of a noble status to be allowed to wear that purple stripe, or the purple-blue stripe. So he's standing clothed in purple, all purple, so a very fancy garment, and with the hair of his head finely trimmed, and with his armed men all around him, so that if we condemn him by our law, he may slay us, and by overbearing justice may himself escape death. But I don't make this complaint against Herod himself. He is obviously going to be more concerned for himself than for the laws. My complaint is against yourselves, the people of the court, and your king, who give him a license to do so. However, take notice that God is great, and that this very man whom you are going to absolve and dismiss, for the sake of Hyrcanus the king, will one day punish both you and your king himself also. Nor did Sameas mistake any part of this prediction. For when Herod had received the kingdom, which he eventually did, he slew all the members of the Sanhedrin, and Hyrcanus himself as well, except for Sameas, because he had a great honor for him on account of his righteousness, and because, when the city was afterward besieged by Herodes and Sosius, he persuaded the people to admit Herod into it, to let Herod in, and told them that for their sins they would not be able to escape his hands, which things will be related by us in their proper places. This story is being told by a Jewish general who sees himself as a historian. He is using historical modes that are familiar to the Roman people, presenting this in a way that certainly will be favorable to the Roman government. This is something that was preserved for us in Greek, that we can go and get off the shelf. he has his agenda for telling the story. I would like to move now to the rabbinic story, which is an artistic telling. I wanted to give you the background, what someone else gave as the story. Would anybody like to read in Hebrew or in English? English would be fine.
English.
Yes, please. On page 3. This story is found in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, crosses over from page 19a to 19b.
Rav Yosef said.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. The thing that I left out, this is responding to a Mishnah that says, kings, we do not judge, they don't serve as judges on courts, and we do not judge them. They are, what does the presidents and congressmen have while they're in office?
Immunity?
The immunity. They have immunity from crimes. Yes. So they don't sit on courts, and they are not judged by courts because of their special roles. And Rav Yosef responds to that Mishnah.
Rav Yosef said, this was only taught regarding the kings of Israel. But the Davidic kings do judge and are judged, as it is written, O house of David, thus said the Lord, render just verdicts morning by morning. Jeremiah 21:12. And if we do not judge him, how could they themselves judge? For is it not written in Zephaniah 2:1? Gather together, gather, and Resh Lakish said, judge yourself, and afterwards judge others.
Pause just, if you'll pause just a moment.
Yes.
Rav Yosef makes a qualification on the Mishnah. That Mishnah only applies to the kings of Israel, that we don't judge them and we don't allow them to be judged. The Davidic kings we understand from the Torah, and he brings verses to explain why, of course, kings of the house of David, meaning the good kings, the kings that we like, the true kings, do in fact participate in those roles because God says to the house of David, render just verdicts, so that they must be able to judge. And we have Reish Lakish making a midrash on this verse, bringing a midrash that you can only judge others once you yourself are subject to judgment. And so therefore, obviously, the Davidic kings, since they judge, were subject to judgment, and this Mishnah doesn't apply to them. It must apply to the other kings, the kings of Israel, the bad kings, which we're going to hear about in a moment.
Rather, the kings of Israel. For what reason not? Because of an incident which occurred. When the slave of Yanai Malka killed someone, Shimon bet Shetach said to the sages, put your eyes upon him and let us judge him. They sent to him, your slave killed someone, send him to us. He sent him to them. They sent to him, they sent to him? Yeah.
They sent a message to him.
Yeah, I guess so. Come you yourself here as well. And its owner was warned, Exodus 21:29. The Torah has said, let the owner of the ox come and stand for his ox. He came and sat. Shimon ben Shetach said to him, King Yanai, stand upon your feet and let them testify against you. And not before us do you stand, but before that one who spoke and the world came into being do you stand, as it says, Deuteronomy 19:17. And the two men who have the dispute shall stand. He said to him, not as you say, but rather as your fellows shall say. He turned to his right. They cast their faces to the ground. He turned to his left. They cast their faces to the ground. Shimon ben Shetach said to them, you are great schemers. Let the master of schemes come and collect from you. Immediately Gabriel came and buried them in the ground, and they died. We buried them first. In that hour, they said, the king does not judge, and we do not judge him. He does not testify, and we do not call him to testify.
Okay.
More?
Nope, just till there. Yanai Malka is Alexander Jannaeus, who is one of the Hasmonean kings. That name sort of becomes a stand-in for all the Hasmonean kings, all the male Hasmonean kings. Salome Alexandra, we do differentiate. We know who she is pretty clearly, even in rabbinic sources. We liked her. She was nice to the rabbis or to the proto-rabbis. The other ones were all... my grandmother of blessed memory used to say when she was growing up, so they were very careful about manners in her family. She was born in Russia, and you didn't have something nice to say about someone. You just said, they're a real piece of work. So all the other kings, the rabbis felt, were real pieces of work. The slave of the Hasmonean king killed someone. In fact, Herod, by popular legend, was understood to have started out as a slave, became freed, and then rose his way through the ranks. So, from what we have seen before, Herod could clearly be referred to here. The court is citing biblical verses and using biblical verses to draw on authority for how procedure happens. They are likening the slave, in this case Herod, to an ox that gores. So when you have an animal that tends to run wild and cause damage, it is the obligation of the owner to keep it in check. And if not, then the owner is responsible for all damages that are caused and may even be liable for the death penalty when the ox kills. So the servant killed, and they're calling him to court. In fact, the king figure does come to court, but there is some kind of intimidation that is going on here as well. Shimon ben Shetach is the one, like Sameas, I think his name was Sameas in the Greek, Sameas, who stands up and is unafraid to shout out and call out everyone else for not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I read it as he's the one who turns to his right and everyone's not looking. And he turns to his left and everyone's not looking. No one can meet his gaze because they know that they're going to find the king. They're not going to force the king to follow procedure. And the longer case may in fact be that what's also going on is the judgment of the slave. When the king comes after his slave is called to court, the implication is that the king's presence is going to bias the court and make justice impossible to serve. In fact, that is what happens. Shimon ben Shetach, as this rabbi, is the one who says, just you guys watch out, because you're going to get it. And a miracle happens, and an angel comes down and sticks them all on the ground like tent pegs. And that historical event, according to this story, is the source for our Mishnah. We can talk about law. We'll talk about law next time. But I want to ask you to turn the page. And I want to talk about the structure of the story. Because one of the aspects of art in an art story is structure. So the story has three parts, potentially. One is the part of Shimon ben Shetach and the sages before the king gets there. It sets the stage for what's going to happen. There's when Shimon ben Shetach confronts the king, there's this dramatic opposition, and then there's the realization that Shimon ben Shetach is standing totally by himself. He's all out front because he's confronting the king with the power of the Sanhedrin, and he looks around and no one is with him. So knowing that no one is with him, he turns around and confronts the sages. Three separate sections that one could look at in the story. According to Yonah Frankel, that is one characteristic structure of rabbinic stories. They may have two parts, a front and a back. They may have three parts, a frame setting, a drama, and a denouement. They may have chiastic structures, which fortunately this one does. A chiastic structure is when something goes A, B, C, C, B, A. You go upstairs, you go downstairs. When I was in middle school, we learned that short stories have the classic five-part structure of introduction, rising action, climax, denouement, and then the wrapping up part at the end. So that is a chiastic structure. It goes A, B, C, B, A. And if you look at the numbers that are here, starting with 0, I set up this story with numbers because it fits nicely a chiastic structure. The first part where everything is in line, I just took the words of the story in English and I assigned them numbers. because of an incident which happened when the slave of Yanai killed someone. And if you look, we go all the way up to 6, and then we come back down to 0. The 0 and the 0 prime go together. The 1 and the 1 prime go together. So, descriptively, I put that down on the bottom. The first 0 in the beginning, an incident which occurred, is an assertion that this ruling of the Mishnah is because of an historic event. And that goes with what comes at the end of the story. In that hour they said, the king does not judge and we do not judge him. The assertion that this incident was the onset for the current ruling. Artistic stories get nicely tied up in a ribbon. One possible way of reading them is that they are entirely self-contained. All you need to know is completely within the story, and sometimes, as in this one, is very nicely bookended. The Mishnah is that way because of something that happened, and this thing that happened is why the Mishnah is the way that it is. And it even restates the Mishnah for us. So it ties the bow up very nicely. When the slave of Yanai killed someone, in 1, goes together with Gabriel coming and burying them in the ground. So the anonymous person's hand at the death of a human slave in the beginning is bookended by the sage's death at the hand of a divine servant. We don't know who the person was who was killed. We should be concerned that the sages were killed, but ultimately, the killing by someone by the slave was a crime, and the crime in the opposite sense is being punished by the rabbis, by the sages on the Sanhedrin who refused to fulfill their role being killed. Number 2, Shimon ben Shetach says to the sages, put your eyes on him and let us judge him, is a statement by the sages, to the sages by Shimon ben Shetach saying, the king is subject to justice. And in the end, when the sages don't hold him to justice, he makes a statement to the sages demanding that they be held to justice. So these, in a chiastic story structure, which is nicely, perfectly conch shell, although it's not a conch shell, that's a different mathematical thing, where it starts and it goes around and around perfectly mathematically. I forget what that is called. Every piece fits with another piece, because the story unfolds and then refolds. In this case, the thing that is the middle, that's the climax of the story, is when the king comes and sits. They call him to come and stand, figuratively, that he should stand for his ox. And then Shimon, when he comes and sits, he's coming to court. Shimon ben Shetach says, you can't sit, you have to stand up. Now, we saw in the Josephus story that when Herod comes, he comes with the guard. He stands in court with his guard. It doesn't make such a big deal in Josephus that he's standing. What the big deal is in Josephus that he's standing with a bunch of thugs around him who are threatening the court. And what Sameas, who actually then is Shimon ben Shetach, says is, how dare you come into this court looking all fancy and behaving like a king and having your thugs around you instead of being in a more modest demeanor. Here the king sits, because by that time, sitting in court was a demonstration of majesty. In Babylonia, we have other attestations in the Torah reading. The Reish Galuta, the one who was the head of the Jewish community, and the Rosh Yeshiva, could sit during the Torah reading. Everyone else presumably was standing. Some of them because they were sitting at the back and had to be able to hear. But that was one of the privileges of the head of the community, was to sit during the Torah reading. Sitting when things are going on demonstrates that you are in a position of privilege in the court. So by that time, that becomes the climax, because that is the claiming of an authority even over the court by the king. In the case of the Josephus story, the issue was that coming with thugs was demonstrating a power that said, I am more powerful than the court. I am not subject to justice. And in this case, by sitting, according to the story, Yanai was refusing to submit himself. And when he is told, you must stand, what is his response? The king says, I'm not going to do what you say. Let everyone tell me. and they refuse to say anything. And that is clearly the point at which things are going downhill. Because there's nothing standing behind Yanai the king. There's nothing standing behind Shimon ben Shetach in contradicting Yanai the king. So one way of looking at stories when you go to read stories is do you already know everything? Is there anything that you need to know to make the story work outside the story? I suppose in this story, hypothetically, we would need to know who Yanai the king was, but we know that he's a king. We need to know who Shimon ben Shetach is, but it seems clear that he has a strong relationship to the sages. We know that you can't kill someone. I mean, that's a little bit common sense. But everything that we need to have happen for the story is in here. I think it's called Chekhov's gun, is a theater playwriting principle. Chekhov allegedly said at one point, if you show a gun in the first act, you better make sure to shoot it by the end of the play. So that stories are understood to be efficient of language. We understand about the Torah that the Torah is efficient in its language. As one of my Rabbeim once said, God is not a blabbermouth. So if it's in the Torah, it is there for meaning, and it tells you something important. So one way of understanding these stories also is that they are efficient of language, and everything that's in there in the beginning is matched by something in the end, at least in the chiastic structure. Not every rabbinic story is chiastic. But I want to turn the page now and look at another story. And let's read it together and propose looking at it with the chiastic structure lens. And see if we can have ideas about what matches to what. I've got my pages out of order. Page 4, super. Would somebody like to read in English? This is from the Talmud in Baba Batra on page 8a. Jordan, please. Yes.
Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi opened his storehouse in the year of famine and said, let the masters of Scripture, master of Mishnah, masters of Gemara, masters of Halakha, masters of Agada enter, but let not ignoramuses enter. Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram pushed and entered and said to him, Rabbi, sustain me. He said to him, my child, have you studied the Scriptures? He said to him, no. Have you studied Mishnah? He said to him, no. If so, by what measure shall I sustain you? He said to him, sustain me like a dog or a raven. He sustained him. After he went out, Rabbi sat and was troubled and said, woe is me, who gave my bread to an ignoramus. Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi said before him, perhaps he is Yonatan ben Amram, who does not want to benefit from the glory of Torah from forever. They investigated and found. Rabbi said, let all enter.
Okay. Does this look to you like a story that you could understand everything that's going on just on the basis of what's in the story?
No.
What is missing?
It goes from not feeding an ignoramus, that kind of principle, to feeding him. And when you get to 6, it's unclear what that, there's some things that are missing, I think, from my mind.
Okay.
Perhaps Yonatan ben Amram does not want to benefit from the glory of Torah from forever. What does that mean?
So what that means from the Hebrew is, She'eno rotzeh lehanot michvod Torah miyamav. He has never wanted to have any extra status because he is engaged in the glory of Torah.
Okay.
Paul?
I want to know something more about the nature of the symbols. What is it about those two? The raven.
Dog or a raven?
The dog and the raven?
That's a great question. And I will answer that in a minute. But from what you know about dogs and ravens, as wild animals, do they need to be fed?
They scrounge for food.
They scrounge for food. So those are animals that generally manage to get by on whatever's out there. That is something that could come from one's own experience. I'm going to propose, yes.
Do you mean that when we're reading the story, before we get to number 6, we assume that Rabbi recognizes who this person that he's interacting with is, that it's Yonatan ben Amram, and then it turns out later you have to understand that he must not have recognized him.
Correct.
That's what yeah, okay.
So that is something that may be a little bit of an issue in the way this text was preserved, because it's not made explicit that Yonatan ben Amram did not identify himself in some way. One of the interpretations I read on this suggested that he, in fact, disguised himself. It's possible that if this story were contemporary, you would hope that a teacher would know all of their students. But in some, we have a story where someone who has a lot of wealth in a year of famine says, I will feed some people but not others. Someone from that class thinks it's not, comes and says, as though he were from the other people who don't, because he intentionally flunks the test. Okay, if I'm allowing scholars to come and have lunch, free lunch, are you a scholar? Yeah. Did you go to Hebrew school? Nah, not so much. Did you go to day school? No, I didn't go to day school. Then why should I let you in? Well, maybe some scraps. So, one thing that I do find unclear in this story is whether he therefore gave him scraps or whether he felt guilty because this guy was coming and begging, and then he gave him a nice amount, and he goes out and he says, "Oh man, I shouldn't have done that." And one of his students comes and pops the bubble. One of the things that is indicative of literary art is playing with point of view, playing with perspective. So one of the things that's fun is who knows what, when. It is clear that Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram knows of Rabbi's rule. He intentionally makes it out in whatever way he does as though he is not entitled, even though he is. So is he breaking the rule?
He's testing.
He's testing the rule. He doesn't technically break the rule, but he forces Rabbi, who's Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, to rethink his rule because he thinks he just fed an ignoramus. And by being forced to re-examine his own misperception, he opens his heart in a year of famine and changes his decision. Is this a chiastic structure? Do pieces match up with each other in a mirror kind of way? And if you think they do, what matches with what? Does number 1 match with anything?
Well, yeah, one is Rabbi states a rule, and then number 7, he's changed the rule.
Good.
So they're opposing views of the same rule.
So I will also admit that I did set you up a little bit by putting this in the table as I did. But if the first one matches the last one, do other steps match with other steps?
You could say. Think about chiasm is, you could say.
So step 2, let's go backwards. In step 6, where Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram's identity is revealed, if we look at it with the chiastic structure, it helps us think that perhaps in step 2, he concealed his identity. And in fact, when he goes in, he doesn't say, I am Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram, which, by the way, we note in step 6, where when the thing that is said about him to his praise is that he doesn't like throwing the title rabbi around. They don't call him rabbi. He doesn't like getting benefit from being called rabbi. But in the beginning, it lets us know that he's a rabbi so that we know from outside the situation that he's not breaking the rule. He is entitled. In step 3, Rabbi tests him and says, what can I do for you? You're an ignoramus. You haven't studied, you haven't learned any Torah, you haven't learned any Mishnah. What am I going to do for you? In step 5, in balance, he says, I gave food to an ignoramus. So in both cases, there's an ignoramus. And in the middle, at the apex, Rabbi's heart is changed by what he hears, by the plea he hears from Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram. So a couple of things. It is typical of good stories that they have dialogue. He wants to keep us involved. In step 3, I'm going to say that with this one, there are things that when we go beyond the wall, so this is one of the criticisms of Werner Frankel's scholarship. The rabbinic stories don't exist in a vacuum. You do have to go beyond the walls of the story. And even though you could say that the story could stand on its own, no rabbinic story does, because everything exists in a place and a time, and it has values that it brings into it. So in step 1, and reinforced in step 3, what do we see about Rebbe's perspectives? Or his attitudes about others? Please.
He determines value based on Torah scholarship.
Yes. And this was something that became endemic in rabbinic culture, even more so in Babylonia, that it was a certain snobbiness about if you studied Torah. And there was actually even extra snobbiness. There was a lot of snobbiness about yichus and family as well. But in the beginning he says, I have all this food, there's a famine, great. Anyone can come in who's a Torah scholar. But so remember, yes?
Interesting, like who's superior to who in the list also.
So this is in order, and some of this list is in order of education. So grammar school, as you would start learning Torah. And then when you got to be a little bit older and you had learned written scripture, you would start learning Mishnah. And then once you got beyond, had memorized enough Mishnah, you would learn the logical arguments back and forth, which is Gemara. And then Halacha is set decisions, which is its own category, and Agada is its own category. It could be seen as a hierarchy. It could also reflect a time by which, when this story is being put together, that there were clearly different roles in education. Once you know the university, you can have a professor of sociology and a professor of biology and a professor of anthropology. But if you go back 200 and something years and you look at early American universities, like maybe not everybody, but the people who we think of as great minds did a little bit of everything, and they actually did a lot of everything. So when you are resource poor, one person has to do everything, sort of chief cook and bottle washer. But when you get to a time when you have different functions, people can specialize.
But if you have that specialization, then it's almost a reverse for the, I mean, if one starts out learning scripture, Torah, and works their way up to Agada, then in a sense, the snobbishness in terms of feeding the scholars would almost ask for the reverse, the reverse listing.
I see. Yes, I think that I'm going to not go into that question as fully here, other than to say there had to be a list. And this was a way that their minds thought about describing the list of specializations. Paul?
Seems to me that this is a descending order, not an ascending order. The level of authority of Scripture supersedes that of Mishnah of Gemara, and Halacha of Agada. Both in terms of the time, one comes before the other, and in terms of the hierarchy of authority. And the whole notion of rabbinic authority is that the further back you go, the higher the level of authority.
That is true. That list is all. The first list is a full list. When Rebbe grills this guy who comes to him, he asks him about two things only: Karita and Shanita. Have you learned scripture and have you learned Mishnah or oral law? Frankly, all the other things are contained within the framework of oral law. But
Isn't that the right to a rabbinic?
potentially, yeah. Well, written law and oral law. Because oral law is more than things that are d'Rabbanan, but it is the discussion of rabbinic law. But that snobbiness of the rabbis about education gets entrenched in rabbinic culture. If there's a lovely story in Vayikra Rabbah about a rabbi who's riding on a donkey and sees a very ugly man, although it may use a very specific word there, and the guy says to him, "Rabbi, how are you today?" And the rabbi says to him, "Is everyone where you're from as ugly as you are?" There's another story, and there it clearly, aside from the fact that the one's on the donkey and is the rabbi, and the other one's walking on foot and is the everyday person, that story explores the question of the relative value just as a function of being a student. This story also challenges it a little bit. There's another story where a rabbi is walking along and finds some very fancy-looking man and decides, oh, this man is nice enough looking. He's very honorable. He's allowed to have dinner with me today. And he invites him back to his house. And after Birkat Hamazon, he says, after eating dinner together, the rabbi says to him, "So tell me, what Talmud have you studied?" "I haven't studied Talmud." "Well, tell me some interesting Mishnah that you've studied." "Never studied Mishnah." "Tell me an interesting verse from the Torah that you remember." "Well, I never really studied much Torah." And he's so frustrated and disgusted. "Well, why don't you just lead Birkat Hamazon?" And the guy says to him, "Let the master of the house bless." Because he doesn't want to say, "I don't know how to say Birkat Hamazon." And the rabbi says to him, "Do you know enough to repeat what someone else says?" And the guy says, "Yes." He says, "Say, the dog has eaten my food. The dog has eaten the rabbi's food." And the guy gets very angry and says, "How dare you insult me? And not only that, but you've stolen my inheritance." And now the rabbi is upset. What do you mean? I don't know you. I don't know what your inheritance is." And the guy says, "It says, Torah tzivalanu Moshe, morasha kehilat." It doesn't say kehilat the rabbi. It doesn't say the morasha of the rabbi. It says morasha kehilat Yaakov. So when you claim that the Torah is all yours, and you give me disdain because I haven't studied, you steal the inheritance that is mine from Moshe, even though I haven't studied. So that snobbiness is something that we see other places. To answer your question, Paul, if we only looked at this story in its closed-off space, we wouldn't know why does he pick a dog and a raven. So if we look in other places, I think the compelling one is a story that is found in Tractate Sanhedrin. There's a Midrash that when Noah and everyone was in the ark, because food was short and space was shorter, everybody in the ark refrained from sexual relations except for three. The dog, the raven, and Ham, Noah's son. According to the Talmud, it says, we have a rabbinic tradition, there were three that had sexual relations in the ark, and all of them were punished, therefore. The dog, the raven, and Ham. The dog was tied, which I think is a reference to when dogs mate. The genitalia are stuck together for some period afterwards. The orev, rake, that the raven spits, which Rashi explains there's an understanding in the ancient world that the male raven inseminates the female raven by spitting semen into its beak, which is kind of creative punishment. Cham laka be'oro. Cham was smitten in his skin. There is an ancient tradition that probably predates the rabbis that Ham was the father of the people of Africa, and it establishes or perpetuates an idea that black skin was a punishment, which was a source that we see in other places as well. But there, the raven and the dog are seen as uncontrollable, lustful animals that are also sinful animals. There's another place where the two animals are put together as animals that are among things that people look at to do soothsaying. It doesn't seem to apply here. But it is true that rabbis incorporated ideas from other places into their stories. And we can't just look at stories as closed things. There are artistic and interesting ways that if we use these tools, we can see how stories work. I want to do one more to wind us up tonight. But we do have to remember that rabbis had lots of things going on in their minds, and they used ideas from other parts of their culture in putting their stories together. The Yerushalmi, in Tractate Megillah, tells the story of Rabbi Judah the prince, who was therefore quite wealthy, who sent to Rabbi Yoshaya the Great one bone, or maybe one spare rib, for lack of a drumstick, and one bottle of wine. And Rabbi Yoshaya sent back the message, "You have fulfilled in us the mitzvah of gifts to the poor." So Rabbi Yehuda the prince went back and sent him a whole calf and a big jar of wine. And Rabbi Yoshaya the Great sent back the message, "You have fulfilled in us the mitzvah of sending of portions, mishloach manot ish l'reyehu, each to his fellow." On its face, it's a nice story. It's got two parts, a beginning and an end. Why does he go back and give the gift a second time? Because Rabbi Yoshaya very politely pointed out, you call this mishloach manos? One drumstick and one little cup of wine. Look, you can do better. And duly rebuked, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, in fact, does some. He does it in a smart way, because in the beginning, Rabbi Yoshaya the Great says, "Thank you, I'm such a poor person." Right? You gave me a gift that you would give a poor person. And in doing so, you have made me poor. And when he goes back, he gives ish matanot, mishloach manot ish l'reyehu, like you give to your fellow. And as a rich person, he gave a gift befitting a rich person. If you would like, on the next page, I invite you to look at the stories that are there. Rabbinic stories include humor, they include irony. Those are aspects of literary craft. They're things that we put in the way that we tell stories to make stories interesting, and that invite you, as we continue to move forward, to remember, and as you learn, that we tell stories because they are fun, and we want to tell stories in ways that are beautiful and meaningful. That is one of the aspects of rabbinic stories, part of the art of storytelling. They are carefully thought out. They often pick their words for very careful choices because they have meaning within the structure to give a mirror structure, or to draw things in from beyond that help us understand the story better. And finally, they sometimes like to zing a little bit because they want us to understand that humor is also part of how God wants us to live in the world. And so that as we study how to live as Jews, we remember every once in a while to laugh. And that note, I wish you, if there are questions, I wish you Chag Purim Sameach. Have a festive week. If you're fasting tomorrow, a meaningful fast. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks on Wednesday.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.